The European Union is launching legal action over the British government's plans to override parts of the agreement governing post-Brexit trade with Northern Ireland. Brussels accuses London of breaching international law, whilst the UK government says that it's taking the necessary steps to protect the fragile peace and stability in Northern Ireland. Rosie Burchard has the latest from Brussels.
Some EU politicians have called this a low point in EU-UK relations. Now, on Monday, the UK government put forward plans to unilaterally change parts of a treaty negotiated by both sides to solve the conundrum of how to trade after the UK left the European Union. Post-Brexit, there is now a land border between Britain and the EU on the island of Ireland, between Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK, and Ireland, which is part of the EU. Now, the solution that London and Brussels came up with post-Brexit is to have checks on goods entering Northern Ireland from the rest of the UK. Because Britain no longer needs to abide by EU health and safety rules, Brussels says some oversight is needed. Now, that solution was designed to avoid a hard border with Ireland. But with the North's troubled political history of conflict, some communities there are deeply unhappy with this setup, and that's why the UK government says it needs to change the deal unilaterally. The EU, however, says this move could actually risk that fragile peace in Northern Ireland and warns that it also breaches trust and international law. It's therefore taking the UK to court. This could result in fines, and in the longer term, there could also be a risk of some sort of trade war. Both sides here say they want to protect peace and promote prosperity in Northern Ireland, but they have very different views on how to get there. Rosie Burchard, SABC News, Brussels.
Well, for some analysis, we're now joined by Professor of Sociology at the University of Johannesburg, Professor Patrick Bond. Prof, thanks very much indeed for joining us. In simple terms, help us understand the Northern Ireland Protocol and why it's causing so much of a hoo-ha.
It's nice to be with you and the viewers again, Peter. Look, this is a very interesting area. It's actually where I was born, and so I follow it carefully because even President Cyril Ramaphosa went to Northern Ireland to try to help solve some of the centuries-old fighting between Catholic and Protestant communities. And after a split about 100 years ago that created the Republic of Ireland, what we know as Ireland, and kept Northern Ireland, a few counties, within the United Kingdom. That's Great Britain and the United Kingdom. So we really have to go way back to say this very, let's call it a unstable situation, which led to fighting in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, right through 1998. A Good Friday Agreement then stabilized the situation because it basically erased the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic. And that's really what's at stake. It's whether the more conservative forces restore that border, especially over trade, which when Brexit occurred, really forced a choice. And would Northern Ireland be considered part of Europe and with Ireland, and thereby there be a border in the Irish Sea on the one hand, or would, as some of the conservatives wanted, a hard border be reestablished? Because the latter approach was so dangerous because of the potential for re-establishing that political tension, Boris Johnson lied to his people. There's no question about it. He said there will be no border in the Irish Sea in your products, and back and forth. And of course, when he had to actually, he got to the kind of Brexit 2016, 2019, he won the prime ministership. But when he negotiated it, then he actually had to cut Northern Ireland off in that way, in sort of a trade relationship. That, Peter, is what is so untenable for the Northern Irish Conservatives, called the Democratic Unionist Party. And they're Boris Johnson's allies, but they've been so disappointed. And last month they lost a huge share of their vote because the Protestants of Northern Ireland said, look, you're not really credible. And their main enemy, Sinn Féin, which was formerly the party of the Irish Republican Army, actually has more seats in this new Northern Irish Parliament, but the Conservatives are blocking the potential opening. And it's a very tense situation, especially after Boris Johnson has just survived this no confidence vote. So it's a mix of politics and economics. It's quite untenable.
I grew up in the UK in the 70s, so the Northern Ireland story is one that I remember it being in the news all the time. And I just wonder, are those tensions still alive today, that we saw people literally at war back then?
Thank goodness that this Good Friday Agreement from 1998, really, especially after it was fully implemented in 2005, created an interesting fusion, Peter. So if you're in the north of Ireland, you actually could retain an Irishness. But then when the European Union continued to grow and Ireland did very well, it had a crash in 2008, 9, 10, but it kind of came back as a sort of, low a tax haven. And there was a lot of economic activity. So the North, especially the younger people, began to avoid what you were worried about. That is, a return to those awful processes of British and Northern Irish Protestant repression of the Catholics and Catholic, especially IRA war in response. And as a result, you saw fusion through economic interest. And then came Brexit to essentially create, a new set of problems. And then Sinn Féin's rise, which was, I think, a surprise to many, that they're really the majority, well, not the majority, 29%, but they've taken more seats than the Democratic Unionists. And their agenda is actually a full unity between the North and the Republic to kind of follow through that earlier Irish nationalist politics. And there are some, certainly, I know in my own Protestant background, some of the younger people, some of the people who have economic interests in Europe, they'd be happy with that. So this isn't the same old Protestant Catholic. There is an old Protestant relationship to the United Kingdom, right, to allegiance to the Queen and to the sort of idea, and that still is very important. So let's say about 40% of the Northern Irish Parliament and its citizenry would still like to be with Britain, but that 60% now, even some Protestants say, look, we don't really need to mess with the arrangement which set up that border in the Irish Sea. And now Boris Johnson is messing with it, and that's why the European Union is thinking, well, we'll take you to court and we'll start, in a sense, a trade war that way. That could become much more serious. Right now, the differences in EU and UK laws, for example, agricultural regulations, sanitary standards, the kinds of things that bog down trade, they're not that big a deal, but they could be in the future. And that's why this particular break that Boris Johnson wants to erase that border that he put in after he'd sort of fibbed about it. That's why it could be the sort of, the basis for a major confrontation with the EU, and the European Union Court of Justice could bring some penalties against Britain, and then Britain would probably say, well, under Boris Johnson, we don't really respect those, and yet more tensions arise.
But I mean, I remember the whole Brexit conversation. This was always going to be one of those issues, and one always got a sense, even back then, because there were threats, that this day would come. So I guess we shouldn't be surprised, but I guess now the question is, what could be the consequences if Boris says, you know what, we're doing it, forget it, whatever you think, Mr. Europe, and Mr. Europe does go to international courts and say, you can't actually. What will be the consequences for the losing side?
Well, I think actually you'll find them on the ground in Northern Ireland. And one of the ways that's happening is that with Boris Johnson trying his best to restore a certain gravity, having lost it completely last month in that vote of no confidence, with the sense that his end is nigh, he's going back to his roots, which are the kind of right-wing Brexit English nationalism. And now he's trying to restore that old relationship with the Democratic Unionist Party, essentially the Tory equivalent in Northern Ireland, that was, really furious with him for cutting a deal that chopped them out. And I think then what they're going to do is say their chip in this is that they can deny that the Stormont, the parliament in the north, would go into session. And if they do that, then the default is that London rules Northern Ireland, and that creates yet more tensions, given nobody really wants Boris Johnson to be doing the sorts of, control freakery he's known for, and, flimsy, often, quite unpredictable rule. And I think in Northern Ireland, particularly because of this potential with Sinn Féin as the leader of the parliament, if it does convene, then the real direction is towards unity with Ireland. It may take years, but the point is the demographics are changing. Catholics and those wanting to see that union are growing in strength. And that's the underlying question. Is Boris Johnson putting a last gasp brake on that process, or because of his bumbling, he's actually speeding it up?
The European Union, I suppose, has to get its rules right. Otherwise, once you start making too many exceptions, other people would then start demanding theirs as well.
Oh, I know, and this is such an interesting moment for Europe. Does it really exist as a coherent bloc? Economically, it has, largely because big companies wanted to have a single market, and they got it, and sort of lowered the social wage and made it tough for ordinary people there. And the fight back on that, one example that will affect us is climate change, because Europe will have a unified tax, a carbon border adjustment mechanism, a climate sanctions that will actually begin next year, and it'll start affecting South African exports. And what they've just decided this week is that, at least in committee, we see if the whole process unfolds, is that Europe now says that gas, methane gas, natural gas, cannot be considered green, and it won't be an exemption if Eskom suddenly moves, as they want to, 44% of their just energy transition to methane, to bringing in the gas from northern Mozambique or maybe offshore. And that's where the European Union's, along with, of course, the single biggest problem, which is what should Europe do in terms of its addiction to Russian gas and oil. And as we see now, 3 European leaders of the 3 biggest countries, France, Italy, and especially Germany, actually going to Ukraine and trying to shore up and increase their defense spending and give more weapons to the Zelensky government to withstand this invasion. So it's a fascinating time, and it feels fluid, especially because you've got this guy in London, Boris Johnson, who's, for his own political purposes of survival and strengthening his own legitimacy, he's playing with fire here.
These are interesting times, certainly, and you and I both lived through a lot of transitions, but fascinating chatting to you about Northern Ireland and the feeling generally of Irish people on both sides of the border. Thank you so much indeed for those insights.
Thanks, Peter.